What's going on, everybody? Welcome back to the channel. Today's going to be diving back into some budget decks, going kind of over some budget decks that actually don't require any rares to start out and playing, while having a decent chance to actually get yourself started, whether you're looking to play some sort of monocolor starter deck. For the most part, unfortunately, mono blue really doesn't have a very good budget rare friendly starter deck. So other than that one, most of the starter decks here are monocolored. Blue, we kind of go into the Dimir sphere to kind of get a little bit of help from black to kind of help us out overall that way. With that being said, if you like the video, hit that like button. It definitely helps out the channel a lot. If you're new here, when I post new videos on the channel, hit that subscribe button. With that being said, let's just dive in the decks and let's just talk about it. Just wanted to give a special shout out to the channel members that you see your names here. These are the people who support the channel by either clicking the join button that's down below right next to the subscribe button if you want to get your name here on this list, or you can click the link in the description. I do appreciate it as it does help support the channel. Now on with your video. So the one thing I noticed in some of my budget decks is that some people complain that I had too many rares in the deck. So today's video, we are playing 0 rares in most of these starter decks. I don't think there's actually one that does have a rare in it. And the first one up is we do have a Dimir Control budget deck. So the idea of the deck is just to keep the board as clean as possible for as long as possible and kind of slowly grind your opponent down that way. Because we are playing a lot of commons and uncommons, we do, have, we don't really have a big, way to finish out the game as a whole. But other than that, I mean, the deck that we have here is pretty good nonetheless. It does have a lot of ways to disrupt what your opponent's playing, or just keep the board clean and help you kind of just slowly whittle your opponent away life total side by side. So with that being said, I mean, the first card up is Bloodchief's Thirst. Overall, it's a very solid removal spell. It destroys target creature or planeswalker for mana value 2 or less for 1 mana. If you kick it for the additional 3 mana, you destroy target creature or planeswalker. So a very good spot removal spell. The one downfall to it is a sorcery speed spell, so you can only do it on your turn. Other than that, I would say it's a very good card. Next after that, we have Disdainful Stroke. It's a 2 mana counter target spell with converted mana cost 4 or greater. Essentially just counter anything big. A lot of your big explosive decks play very big drops. Let's just say Goldspan Dragon's kind of one of the cards I can think of off the top of my head. Allrun's Epiphany is another. This is a 2 mana counter any of those kind of big spells that are 4 or more. They have the Jawari Disruption here as a, early game disruption, as, in the early turns for 2 mana, you can counter pretty much, if your opponent taps out completely to play one spell, you can make them counter that spell unless they pay that 1 additional mana, which in most cases, especially in the early turns, they completely tap out and they don't have 1 additional mana. In the late game, you can always play it as the reverse side and play it as a land to get your additional land drops, because lands are pretty important when it comes to control matchups. Having more lands and be able to play multiple spells to kind of slow down your opponent and what they're doing is definitely very good. And Jawari Disruption is that card that kind of helps us in the early game disrupt what our opponent is doing. Then we have a Negate here. It's kind of one of those one-offs in the deck. It's every now and then your opponent plays that non-creature spell, and you just have 2 mana open to negate it. Negate's a very good spell in that aspect. There are a lot of okay spells that I do think people will cast that aren't creatures for the most part. Though I would say especially in the very heavy aggro matchup and a lot of best of ones, unfortunately Negate doesn't hit a lot of things, but it does hit that occasional Allrun's Epiphany and things like that. So it's good to have in the deck as a one-of. Then we have Flunk. Flunk is kind of one of those other, removal spells that I think, depend on the situation. Great against very small aggro creatures, nothing that isn't too large in power. Kind of, struggles a little bit if your opponent can kind of keep a handful if they have larger creatures, but it is a removal spell that gives target creature -X/-X until end of turn, where X is 7 minus the number of cards in that creature's controller's hand, which can be very good, especially if they really dump their hand completely. You can really eliminate, any particular creature. Also gets around indestructibility, because if your creature becomes less than a 0/0 and it's indestructible, it essentially gets removed that way. So it is a good way to get around that indestructibility. Other than that, a very good card nonetheless. Then we have Power Kill. It's a card that I feel like is hit or miss depending on the matchup, as it does have very limited things it can target it. I mean, there aren't a lot of, unless you're playing angels, unless you're playing demons, unless you're playing devils or dragons. This card pretty much hits anything for 2 mana, though in those matchups where you do maybe see a Goldspan Dragon, or you're playing against Orzhov Angels or something like that, it doesn't really hit much there, and it's kind of like a dead card. But I think for 2 mana, it is a card that we can definitely put in the list, as it is a card that hits most things that I think people do play in the format. Then, of course, because we are playing blue, you always have to have more counterspell disruption, and we have Solid Summon. I think Solid Summon overall is a great counterspell. It's something you can set up in the early game and then only cast it for, the 1 mana discount later in the game for 1 blue and a colorless, by foretelling for 2 colorless, or outright it's a 3 mana counterspell, just like Cancel, and having its diversity, being able to play at 2 different mana costs is definitely very good. And sometimes even when you have this face down, your opponent maybe slows down a little bit because they know you have that counter, and just maybe waiting for that proper card to counter with this spell, as it can counter any target spell, is definitely very good to have in a deck that is looking to disrupt what your opponent's doing. Then yet again, we have Poison the Cup, a 3 mana destroy target creature spell, or destroy target creature. If this spell was foretold, you get to scry 2, so you get another card you can, foretell. The one great part is if your opponent knows you're playing blue, they may think you are playing Saw Coming, so you can always slide a Poison the Cup as a foretold card. Maybe your opponent now thinks it's a counter spell, and maybe they play a little bit slower on their own because they don't want their spell countered. So Poison the Cup is yet again another very good card to decept your opponent in that way. Nonetheless, I do think the Scry 2 is also very strong if you do play this for its foretold cost, as being able to kind of, look at the top 2 cards of your library and put them to the bottom, or keep one on top, or swap them, or do whatever you want with the top 2 cards of your library is definitely very good to set you up to hopefully either draw more answers and or maybe draw more lands depending on what the situation is. But Poison the Cup I do think is kind of like that okay kind of card when it comes to removal. Then in the 4-drop slot, we have Behold the Multiverse. It's a 4 mana scry 2, draw 2 cards at instant speed. We can foretell it in the early game for 2 mana and then cast it in the later game for additional 2 mana. Scrying 2 and then drawing 2 is definitely very good. You can either keep the top 2, you can put one on the bottom, keep one on top, draw 2 cards, which one card is what is going to be, and the other card is kind of like a blind card. Definitely a very good card, just with how cheap you can make it in the later game. Sure, you're still paying 4 mana, but spreading that mana across multiple turns is definitely very good. And yet again, it is in that foretold slot, which also blends in well with Saw Coming, so your opponent could always think when you foretell one of these, it could be a Saw Coming, unless you've already played like somehow 4 of them. But yet again, a very good card for 4 mana. Then we have Dog Pursuit. This is kind of an interesting card here. This is kind of like, as we're trying to build this deck that is really, as you can see, very creature heavy removal, very spell disruptive heavy. This is kind of a card that is looking to play that long game, as it is an enchantment for 4 mana. At the beginning of your end step, each opponent loses 1 life and you gain 1 life. It's kind of going to slowly drain your opponent out in that way. If you have multiples of the out, then all of a sudden you're pinging your opponent for additional points of life loss, and you're going to gain additional life. Definitely a very interesting card. It's not going to win you any games quickly, but we're not going for the quick game, especially playing control. We're just going for the long, slow grind. And, this could be one of those ways that if everyone has no enchantment disruption, they're going to slowly get drained out. So pretty interesting card to have here in the deck overall, playing that deck that really has no creatures that really doing any sort of threat. Then in the 5-drop slot, we have Teargrid Shadow. It's a 5 mana instant speed. Each player sacrifices 2 creatures, and you can foretell it to make it only cost 4 mana. This is another interesting card here. It's very good if your opponent plays very more of the mid-rangey, where they're only playing maybe 2 or 3 creatures, and making them sacrifice 2 is definitely going to really disrupt them. If their opponent's playing a very wide board, this card doesn't hit as hard, but it is overall pretty interesting card here, as we also don't play many creatures. So making us sacrifice creatures is not going to hurt us as much unless we really have creatures out in the battlefield. But none again, it's definitely a very disruptive card in the fact that it can, just make your opponent at instant speed sacrifice creatures, whether it's in attack steps, whether it's in, their upkeep, whether it's during your turn. It's definitely a good card to have, to have as a big kind of explosive spell, I guess, in the deck. And then the last card up is Nefari Betrayer King. It's a 5 mana 4/3 zombie wizard legendary. Other zombie creatures you control get +1/+1, and for 3 snow mana, we can return them from the graveyard to the battlefield tapped. So this is definitely another interesting card here, because we can do this at any speed. So if he does get removed in some sort of way, whether we chump block or whether we have to sacrifice him in that part, we can always pay 3 additional mana, get him back onto the battlefield at instant speed at the end of our opponent's turn, and then all of a sudden he can attack in on our turn. So definitely a very cool card. Definitely fits very well with the deck, as it's, as long as our opponent doesn't exile it, we do have good ways of getting it onto the battlefield, whether for 5 mana or for 3 mana. It's not going to give any other zombies in our deck +1/+1, as we don't play any other creatures other than himself. But yet again, kind of like our big card that is going to try to finish off our opponent. And because we are playing this card, we are playing snow mana. So you have 11 of the snow-covered islands, 10 of the snow-covered swamps, and 4 of the ice tunnels. Our additional mana source is the Joy Disruptions if we do really need the additional mana. So we are sitting at roughly 25 mana plus 3 mana from the Destroy Disruptions. So we are at 28 total mana. Yet again, another deck that is very good, very cheap. Like I said, it's just full of commons and uncommons. For the most part, I think it's a decent balance of a lot of the sets that are going to be in 2022. So it is 2022 legal. So that is kind of a pretty cool deck to play if you're looking to play some sort of deck that has blue in it. Unfortunately, blue doesn't really have any sort of way to play a mono-colored version. but it's definitely a good start if you're looking to play that control style matchup. Now, this next deck up on the list is another interesting deck that I do think is kind of like that, you know, if you're looking to play that mono green aggro style deck, this is definitely a deck that gets you kind of closer to like the meta mono green. It's not as good, I would say, just because, you know, we are playing commons and uncommons. There are no rares in the deck, so we have really no big explosive cards. But if you do have a few mono green rares that you do see in like the meta version, you can always replace out cards that are of equal value and things like that. But it is kind of playing that same mindset. We are playing snow mana, so we're doing snow things, as well as we're trying to ramp up a little bit to try to get our bigger things out on the battlefield that much sooner. We are playing cards like Blizzard Brawl, which is definitely a good 1 mana fight spell. Choose target creature control, choose target creature we don't control. If we have 3 or more snow permanents, target creature control gets +1/+0 and gains indestructible, and then those creatures fight each other. It is a sorcery speed spell, but it's definitely very good. You know, as our land base is only snow mana, so us, you know, drawing 3 snow lands at least is definitely going to be very good. So that is kind of one of those things. The one downfall is we can only do it on our turn, so we have no real way to disrupt, you know, our opponent's creatures on their turn, unfortunately. Spear Sentinel, it's another great 1-drop in the deck. It's a 1/2 with reach. We can tap it and an untapped creature we control, and we can add 1 mana to the mana pool. So it's definitely very good. You play this on turn 1. You play your land on turn on turn 2. Then you play your creature on turn 2 as well. Tap this and that creature, and then tap your mana. You can now play a 3-drop on turn 2, which you're kind of ramping up. And that's kind of the key goal, is to kind of ramp up and get to our big things as quickly as possible, because you're trying to outpower your opponent as early as possible, which is kind of like the goal of mono green. Then we have Snakeskin Veil as a great spot removal, kind of like disruption. If our opponent tries to spot remove one of our creatures, we can play this card in response. It gets to put a +1/+1 counter on target creature we control, and that creature gains hexproof, nullifying the spell your opponent may be targeting your creature with. Therefore, you know, canceling it out, and the spell doesn't, it fizzles, and they don't get the effect. And also, you know, it's one of those things, you know, if you do need that additional +1/+1 counter, maybe your opponent plays something, and just giving your creature that additional boost is always very good. But the hexproof, I think, is the main reason why we want to play this card. It kind of saves our creature from any sort of disruption. Then Tarju Blightblade, a 1 mana 1/1 with Death Touch. All in all, it's not a very impressive creature. It is a 1/1 with Death Touch, and I think that's really why it's here in the deck. It makes a great chump blocker, because anything it blocks, as long as the creature it's blocking doesn't have first strike, this will kill it regardless of its power and toughness, because Death Touch does that, which is definitely very good to have. And it makes your opponent not want to attack it as aggressively, because they're not going to want to lose, you know, like a 3/3 to a 1/1, because especially if the 3/3 is definitely very good. Losing it to a common 1/1 is definitely not a way you want it to go, unless you have some sort of trick to get around it. But other than that, Tarju Blightblade is a great 1-drop in the deck. Then in the 2-drop slot, we have Intrepid Outlander. It's 2 mana 2/3 with reach. It has Pack Tactics. If you attack with creatures with total power 6 or greater this combat, venture into a dungeon. Which is definitely very cool. Venturing mechanic is definitely very good for, I think, newer players, as it kind of gives you additional benefits as you play the game without actually having to have cards that do these particular things. You get to pick 1 of 3 dungeons, and depending on the situation, you can always pick a dungeon that, you know, fits your needs. I always think the middle dungeon's always the best dungeon, just because it doesn't have many chapters to it, and you can get through it pretty quickly. But if you want to go through the deeper dungeon, like the Mad Mage, or the one that actually hurts you and your opponent, you can choose either of those. But, you know, doing the venture thing is always very good. Having a creature with reach is definitely very good if your opponent plays some sort of flyers. And, you know, it's just a decent card for 2. Decent toughness as well for a 2-drop, so it definitely blocks a lot in the 2-drop slot, especially in the early game. 3 toughness is definitely hard to come by in a 2-mana creature, so definitely a good card. They have Sculptor of the Winter. It's a 2 mana 2/2 and has the ability to untap target snow land. So in a weird way, it in itself produces mana, because it allows us to untap a snow land to then tap it again for additional mana. So we can tap out and maybe, like, you know, play a creature a turn earlier, because we can untap a land to then tap it to float another additional mana to then play that creature. So just a good card that helps us kind of ramp up as well. Then we have Tangled Florahedron. It's a 2 mana 1/1 that can tap and add green mana. It can also be as a land in the battlefield tapped if we need to. So just a very good card. I do think if you're thinking your opponent's playing some sort of disruption and they're trying to, you know, remove a lot of creatures from the battlefield, you always play this as a land. If your opponent's maybe playing aggro and you're just trying to ramp and get your bigger things out, you play it as the creature. I do think you kind of figure out, based on what the situation is, what side you want to play of the card. Other than that, it's a very good ramp card at 2 mana. Then in the 3-drop slot, we have Boreal Outrider. It's a 3 mana 3/2, and whenever we cast a creature spell, if any snow mana was spent, of that spell's colors was spent to cast it, That creature enters the battlefield with additional +1/+1 counter on it, so it's definitely a good way to get that additional +1/+1 counters on any of our creatures, whether they're small creatures, the big creatures. You know, having a creature come into the battlefield that much stronger is always very good, especially turns earlier is always very good. It's just definitely a good benefit to have. Not much more I can say other than that. You know, spend additional mana to get a creature with additional +1/+1 is definitely good at the end of the day. Then we Spirit of the Alderguard. It's a 4 mana 0/4. When it enters the battlefield, we can search our library for a snowland, reveal it, put it into our hand, then shuffle. So the first ability is definitely very good because it allows us to thin our deck a little bit, getting the snowman out of our deck. It allows us to draw more creatures and responses to what our opponent's doing. And the other cool thing about this card, it gets +1/+0 for each other snow permanent you control. And that's just not lands. We do play other snow creatures, as you can kind of see prior, like the Boreal Outrider, the Sculptor of the Winter. Those are other two creatures we could have on the battlefield as this comes out. So we can come out on turn 4, being a 5/4, a 6/4, depending on what the situation is. So overall, like, this is kind of one of our big creatures that our opponent kind of has to get rid of, or they're gonna have to deal with this bear, beating them down for turns after turns unless they disrupt it. Then the last card up we have in the deck is the Owlbear. It's a 5 mana 4/4 with trample and has keen senses. When it enters the battlefield, we get to draw a card. So the one thing that green doesn't really have, especially in budget form, is any real good way to draw cards. And this card is kind of like we get to draw a card, which is definitely very good. Trample is also very good because if our opponent isn't playing very strong creatures, trample allows us to go over those creatures. And for 5 mana to get a 4/4 and draw on a card is definitely very good, especially in common form. And other than that, the mana base is 22 lands. Nothing too crazy about this deck. It's just straightforward. We just want to ramp up to our 4 drops as quickly as possible, get like our Spirit Alderguard out as soon as possible, and just start beating our opponent's face down that way. Other than that, I would say the only thing that really is negative against this deck, if our opponent really has any sort of board disruption, it does slow us down because we do have to build our board back up. Other than that, it's a pretty cool deck that I do think if you are trying to play mono green, this is definitely a good way to start, and then maybe expand upon doing the more meta version of the mono green deck as you build up your collection. So this next deck up is a mono red deck, and it's kind of like an interesting deck that I feel like kind of comes around with the starter deck that for mono red, and it plays a key card called Raid Bombardment. So the goal of this deck is to play a lot of creatures that are super weak, but whenever we attack with those creatures, if they have power 2 or less, it deals 1 damage to player or planeswalker for each attacking creature. So it's definitely good in that sense. So we can kind of like play a very small creature board but get very wide, and we attack with a lot of small creatures, and we deal damage regardless of us actually hitting our opponent's face, which is definitely very good. And it's playing a lot of cool cards from the newer stuff. It is playing some of the cards from the mono red starter deck as well, but overall the deck isn't very expensive to play, whether it's casting costs or cards you need to actually play it. The first card up is Fearless Pup. It's a 1 mana 1/1 with First Strike. First Strike is always very good because it deals its damage before the creature it's maybe blocked by it deals its damage if it doesn't have First Strike. And for 3 mana, we can give a +2/+0 into end of turn. So as we kind of build up mana, maybe we need something to do with it. We can always boast. The other thing too is if we swing in with our 1/1, Raid Bombardment triggers before we can actually we can always do the trigger for Raid Bombardment first before we actually pay for the boast. So we can get the 1 point of damage as it's being a 1/1, and then we can pump it to a 3/1, which is definitely very good as well. So it's kind of like our little trick to get around that and maybe swing with a little bit more powerful of a creature. Then we have Fireblade Charger. It's a 1 mana 1/1. As long as it's equipped, it has haste. It's it's pretty cool ability as we do play some equipments, but it's not one of those things we're really looking to do. I think it's the secondary ability, which is what makes it very good. Whenever it dies, it deals damage equal to its power to any target. So we can hit our opponent's face, hit our opponent's creature, maybe to finish off a creature. But the goal here is we're just trying to burn down our opponent as quickly as possible with all our little small 1/1 drops, and this card helps us kind of do that. Then we have Goblin Javelineer. It's a 1 mana 1/1 haster goblin. When it becomes blocked, if it deals 1 damage to target creature blocking it, so it deals 1 damage before the creature actually that blocks it, which makes our opponent have to kind of think of how they want to block it. They have to block it with something that's at least of 2 toughness or 3 toughness or greater for this card not to kill that creature as it's blocking. But other than that, it's a very good aggressive 1-drop to have in the deck. 1 mana 1/1 swing into one's face as quickly as possible is definitely very good. We have Hall Monitor. It's a 1 mana 1/1 with haste. We can tap it for 2 mana and tap it. Target creature can't block this turn, so it allows us to kind of maybe prevent one of our opponent's creatures from blocking. Maybe they have a very big creature in our way, but we have a lot more creatures to swing around it. This creature will tap that creature, not allow that creature to block, and allow us to attack in as aggressively as possible. So definitely a good card to have. Also, it's a 1 mana 1/1, so we can still swing in the turn it comes into the battlefield. So if our opponent doesn't really have anything going on, we can just swing in with the Hall Monitor. Then we have Raging Goblin. It's one of the cards from the Arena set. It is, exclusively to Best of One and that Arena starter deck. It is a 1-mana 1/1 haste Goblin. Nothing too crazy about it. It just swings in as soon as it comes in the battlefield for the most part, which is kind of the key of the deck. We want to get as wide as possible, as aggressive as possible, because the goal here is we're trying to burn our opponent down as quickly as possible and trying to finish off our opponent with the Raid Bombardment at the end of the day. Then we have Shock. It's a great 1-mana instant speed spell that deals 2 damage to any target. The goal here is either to maybe get rid of a pesky blocker in the way or hit it to our opponent's face as they start getting low on life. This card in itself can, just end the game if opponent's at 2 life. So overall, very diverse card for 1 mana is definitely very good. Then we have Tin Street Cadet. It's a 1-mana 1/1, yet again from the Arena set. For the mono red deck, whenever it becomes blocked, we create a 1/1 red goblin creature token. So it kind of makes our opponent think if they want us to block it, because even if they do block it and this ends up dying, we still get a 1/1 goblin to replace it, which is definitely very good. A very strong card for only 1 mana. It is kind of cool to have in a deck as you're trying to keep the board as full as possible, as wide as possible. So this is definitely a good card to have if you're trying to be as aggressive as possible. Then we have Tormentor Summon. It's a 1-mana equipment. Equipped creature gets +1/+1, and whenever equipped creature becomes blocked, it deals 1 damage to defending player. So it kind of has a Rain Bombardment effect in itself. And it's a 1-mana to cast and 1-mana to equip, so it's definitely a strong card in that aspect. Overall, a pretty cool card to have. It kind of makes our, little 1-drops that much stronger, which allows us to still be underneath Raid Bombardment for the most part, because all our little 1-drops are only 1/1s, so it allows them to become more aggressive, which is also pretty cool. Then we have Battlecry Goblin. It's a new card from, Adventures of the Forgotten Realms. If you haven't played Goblins or some form of aggro deck that plays red, you may have seen this card. It's a 2-mana 2/2, and it has an ability that for 2 mana you can tap it, and it allows our goblins we control to have +1/+0 and gain haste on the turn. So it allows all our goblins that we play, which is a fair amount. I mean, for the most part, we have Charger, we have Javelineer, we have Raging Goblin, we also have Tin Street Cadet. I don't think that's a lizard, and this is a pup, of course. But it pretty much pumps our board up, and it has Tactics ability that whenever a goblin attacks, if we attack creatures with power 6 or greater this combat, it deals 1/1. We get to create a 1/1 red goblin creature token that is also tapped and attacking. So it's just another card that makes us as aggressive as possible. There's a lot of times that the 2-mana ability will hit a lot of our creatures, making them even more dangerous to hit our opponent in the face, making them really consider if they want to block our creatures or not, which is definitely very good. And just, us helping to generate more tokens on the battlefield to, swing in that much more aggressively is also good for us, what we're trying to do, and just trying to finish off our opponent as quickly as possible. And then in 3-drop slot, we have Ignis Inspiration. It's a 3-mana sorcery. It deals 3 damage to any target, so we can hit our opponent in the face. We also then get to learn afterwards, so it's definitely very good, as it can be kind of that, another card that can finish off our opponent to, finish out the game. Then we also get to learn, which is another good thing here. The one thing I actually don't see a lot of people do with learn, I know, you're more than likely you're going to want to go to your learn board, but in some situations, it may be better to maybe dump a land, discard our land, and then draw a card is another ability that I do think not many people take advantage of. And then I think in this deck, just trying to make sure we draw threats at any moment is kind of one of those things. And if we're holding lands and we don't need the lands, it's always good to maybe dump a land to maybe try to get another threat. And then we have Raid Bombardment. It's a 3-mana enchantment that whenever a creature we control with 2 or less attacks, it deals 1 damage to the player or planeswalker that a creature is attacking. So it triggers for each creature that we do have attacking. All our creatures, for the most part, make this actually trigger. And then the goal here is just try to burn our opponent down with their power of the creatures, plus this as being additional, damage to kind of finish out for our opponent that way. And then we have 20 lands. The deck isn't super expensive when it comes to casting costs, so three mana is our most expensive thing. So 20 lands I do think suffices as enough lands for this deck to actually function. And then the sideboard, because we are playing Learn, we do have 1 Environmental Sciences in case we really need to draw that land that we're missing on our land drop. Start from scratch as destroy 1 damage, deal 1 damage to any target or destroy target artifacts. Spirit Summon as a 3/2 red spirit, 3/2 spirit token. Expanded Anatomy if we want to put 2+1/+1 counters, give a creature vigilance at end of turn. Elemental Summon as maybe a big creature, get 4/4 red-blue elemental. And then Introduction to Annihilation as, if something your opponent has is very pesky, we want to get rid of it, we can exile target non-land permanent, though they do get to draw a card out of it. So overall, the deck is pretty good. It's very aggressive. The goal here is just to pump out as many, creatures on the battlefield, hopefully get a Raid Bombardment by turn 3, and swing in every single turn and just slowly burn our opponent down that way. Now, the next deck up is a mono black aggro style deck that is very budget friendly, and what it's trying to do, you can kind of see some cards that you may have seen in the Dimir deck. but this one's more focused on actually playing a lot of creatures. We do have Bloodchief's Thirst as a 1-mana removal spell. It definitely hits a lot of things in the early game. In the late game, we can pay that additional mana and hit any creature or planeswalker that costs 4 or more. Dungeon Crawler is another decent 1-drop. It comes in the battlefield tapped, which is unfortunate, but whenever we complete a dungeon, we return it back from our graveyard to our hand. I don't think we have too many ways of really completing dungeons, but it's definitely a good ability to have in case we do have a little bit of that venture mechanic. Then we have Eye Twitch, which is another interesting card here. It's a 1-mana, 1/1 flyer that when it dies, we get to learn, so we do have a learn board in this deck. Flying is definitely good evasiveness, especially in the early turns. Maybe your opponent doesn't have, any cheap flyers, so this thing can get in for some cheap points of damage in the early game, and then maybe in the late game, if it does end up dying, we can then go to our learn board and actually get something that we would want to, play afterwards. Then Malakir Rebirth, which is another interesting card here. It's a modal land. It can be a spell or it can be a land. In the early game, maybe we really need the black mana, so we can put it in the battlefield tapped. But we get to choose target creature. We lose 2 life, and until end of turn, if that creature gains the ability that whenever this creature dies, we get to return to the battlefield tapped and under its owner's control. So if we have to chump block, we can pay this card on that chump blocker, return that creature back onto the battlefield at the cost of 2 life. But then we get another chance with that creature, which is definitely very good in that sense. And maybe catches our opponent off guard, especially if we're trying to set up maybe like a lethal swing back at them. Then the last card in the 1-drop slot is Shambling Gas, another good card. It's a 1-mana, 1/1. Whenever it dies, we get to choose one. Brave the Stench gives target creature -1/-1. And then Search the Body, we get to create a treasure token. Depending on what the situation is, the treasure token can become very good if we're trying to play multiple things in the same turn. But sometimes too, if your opponent plays like a creature, maybe they block this with a 2/2, you get to give the creature that blocked it a -1/-1, also killing that creature in the process, which is also pretty awesome. In the 2-drop slot, we are playing Bloodsky Berserker. This is kind of like a cool card that if you can kind of get this going very early, it become very threatening against your opponent. Whenever we cast our second spell each turn, you get to put 2 +1/+1 counters on Bloodsky Berserker. It also gains Menace, which means it has to be blocked by two or more creatures. So opponent can't just chump block it all game. And for 2 mana, again, a 1/1 that eventually become very, very big and threatening is definitely very good to have, especially in this style of deck, because most of our cards in the 1-drop slot are very cheap and they're expendable to kind of build up and allow us to, maybe play multiple spells to get 2 +1/+1 counters on this card and then give it Menace in that process. We also play Flunk, as I do think it's kind of like a pretty decent 2-drop removal. 4 copies of it, give it target creature -X/-X, where X is 7 minus the number of cards in that creature's controller's hand. We have Grim Wanderer. It's a 2-mana 5/3 with flash. Has this tragic backstory card. It can only be casted if a creature had died this turn. So if our opponent chumps block and a creature dies in the process, we get to play it at flash speed for 2 mana. A 5/3 for 2 mana is definitely very good, but it is kind of situational, so something does have to die in order for this to come out. But if our opponent does say something like a board wipe, we can also play it in flash speed after the board wipe happens, allowing us to be able to maybe swing back in with this card on the following turn. And 5 damage, is definitely very good. Then we play 1 Power Word Kill. It's definitely an interesting one-off. I mean, it's kind of one of those things. I do think the removal is very flexible right now, as I do think there's a couple different removals you can play. Flunk being one of them, this being another. Bloodchief's Thirst is another. Poison the Cup is another card you can always play. So I think depending on where you think works for you, you can always swap out cards depending on what you think of. But we went with Power Word Kill just because it is a 2-mana destroy target, non-angel, non-demon, non-devil, non-dragon creature card. And, in most matchups, it will hit something if your opponent plays a creature. But there's only very few matchups that this card doesn't actually hit those creatures. In the 3-drop slot, we have Vampire Spawn. It's a 3-mana 2/3 that when it enters the battlefield, each opponent loses 2 life and you gain 2 life. So it's just a little bit of a drain. It's a decent chump blocker. Other than that, I mean, it has an interesting kind of trigger when it enters the battlefield, but nothing too crazy. This is definitely something you could always Malakir Rebirth, so you maybe swing in aggressively. You Malakir Rebirth, have a trigger again, because it doesn't say when you cast it, it's just whenever it enters, so maybe getting another trigger of this is definitely very good. But other than that, it's just a 3-mana drain, 2 life kind of thing. We also play Dog Pursuit, because this is another card I do think that, in this deck, because we are attacking as in aggressively because we're on the aggro side, having something that drains our opponent regardless of what happens for 1 point of damage is definitely very good, because that 1 point of damage will stack up and we gain some life in the process. So that's also very good. It allows us to kind of, maybe our opponent's also aggressive and we're trying to, have a race to finish off each other, just swinging back and forth. This will kind of allow us to gain that 1 additional life, and that 1 life may end up mattering in the end of the game. And then, because we are aggro, we're not playing anything super expensive. 22 lands is kind of what we're going with here, with, Dog Pursuit and Vampire Spawn being the 2 top cards in the deck. Most of the other cards are in the 1 to 2 drop slot. Then in the sideboard, we do have Environmental Sciences, just in case in that situation where we really need to draw that land. Necrotic Fumes to get rid of some pesky creature cards or planeswalkers that are maybe in our way. Inkling Summoning, maybe if we want some more flyers to get over maybe a very gummed up ground board. Pest Summoning as some chump blockers to gain that additional life. We have Expanded Anatomy, maybe to give some sort of creature, vigilance and +2/+2. And then Introduction to Prophecy, just in case we need to draw, maybe draw a little bit. For 3 mana, we can scry 2, then draw a card. So maybe set up for a key card that we're looking for to maybe, take advantage, or maybe we need that spot removal. This can be a card that helps us get there. So the next deck up on the list is a mono white budget deck. This is definitely another deck that is very good in the sense that the upgraded version of this deck is also one of the top decks in the meta. So this is definitely a deck that you started down that road. And this one being no rares and no mythics in that sense is definitely, very budget friendly in what it's trying to do. It has a lot of cards from, across various sets of Magic, a lot of them all being 2022 legal. Start off, we have Battlefield Raptors, a 1 mana 1/2 flyer that has first strike, which is also very good. It's just dealing its damage before the opponent creature could maybe block it. Maybe hits a lot of things in the air. But at the same time, too, 1 mana is that 1 damage for 1 mana is definitely very good. Then we have Cold Spell Cleric, because this deck being very cheap, we are able to play second spells a lot of times. If it enters battlefield, if it was our second spell that was cast that turn, we get to put a +1/+1 counter on target creature. It also has Vigilance, which is also very good. So, you can always put on this creature. A 2/2 Vigilance creature for 1 mana is definitely very good. Then we have Guidant Voice as our, kind of like our little bit of a pump spell. It's a 1 mana, put a +1/+1 counter on target creature. We also get to learn. Helps us kind of, play multiple spells in the same turn because it only costs 1 mana. It's kind of like that cantrip spell. And then we get to go to our learn board, which is definitely going to help us out because it's going to keep our tempo going, allowing us to keep on playing multiple spells on the same turn. We have Monk of the Open Hand, another card that has the ability of Fury of the Blows. Whenever we cast our second spell each turn, we get to put a +1/+1 counter on Monk of the Open Hand. It's 1 mana for a 1/1, and as the turns progress, we can then play multiple spells, triggering this ability once, and it starts becoming a bigger creature. Usher of the Fallen, it's a 1 mana 2/1, which is definitely very good. It has the boast ability of tapping 2 mana. We get to create a 1/1 white human warrior creature token. And I think the idea of the deck is really just trying to get as wide as possible, even if our creatures aren't very strong. This like 1 damage here, 2 damage there, it will eventually add up and eventually get us to a point where it will either be wider than our opponent, and we'll slowly whittle them down to 0 life points in that way. So definitely a very good card for 1 mana. Then we have Clarion Spirit, yet again another card that takes advantage of us playing second spells on a turn. Whenever we cast our second spell, we get a 1 white spirit creature token with flying, allowing us to maybe swing over maybe gummed up board that has not a lot of ground creatures on it. That 1 penny damage in the air is definitely gonna matter that way. We have Kabir Takedown as one of these modal lands that has 2 different abilities. It's a 2 mana. Deals damage equal to number of creatures we control to target creature or planeswalker. So kind of like our little bit of removal to get maybe a bigger creature out of the way that's really messing things up of us attacking in. And this deck can play a lot of creatures, gets a lot of token generation, so this thing can hit for a truck, depending on what the creature is. I wouldn't be surprised on like turn 3 if this thing was hitting a creature for like 5 damage. Then we have Professor Symbology. It's a 2 mana 2/1. It enters the battlefield. We get to learn, so we get to go on our learn board, which helps us, kind of keep that tempo going, allowing us to maybe get another spell that we could possibly play on the same turn. Worst case scenario, we can always even discard to draw a card as well, depending on what the situation is. Maybe we drew a planes that we don't need, we just discard it to the graveyard, hopefully to draw another, possible spell that we can cast on the same turn. But still, a 2 mana 2/1 that allows us to also get a card out of it is definitely very good nonetheless. They have Angel Heart Protector. It's a 3 mana 3/2. Enters the battlefield. Target creature control gains indestructible on a turn, so allows us to attack in that much more aggressively because the indestructible creature, regardless of whatever happens, is going to live unless they have some sort of exile effect. So definitely very good in that sense. We do have a decent board of a lot of things that can swing in maybe aggressively. Maybe we have our Monk of the Open Hand at a 4/4. Our opponent has a 4/4 creature. We play this card. It gives our Monk indestructible. We swing it for 4. Maybe our opponent now doesn't block because it will kill their 4/4 in the process. So definitely a pretty cool kind of cleric spell that kind of gives us a little bit more of protection to get in that much more for damage. Then we have Bound in Gold. It's a 3 mana enchantment aura, enchanted permanent can't attack, block, crew vehicles, and its activated abilities can't be activated unless they're mana abilities. So definitely kind of a way to slow down our opponent's things, depending on what the situation is. You know, it pretty much stops a lot of things if you really think about it. It can go to any permanent, doesn't have to be a creature, so that's definitely very good. You know, and then any activated abilities can't be activated unless their mana abilities is also very good. So it kind of lockdowns any sort of artifact that can produce mana or does some sort of additional effect on top of producing mana, which is also another pretty cool thing. And then the idea here that it can't crew vehicles is even if our opponent's creature's useless, like let's just say they play Asika's Chariot and they have 2 cat tokens, that's all they have. If you put on one of the cat tokens, well, they only have 1 cat token now to try to crew their Asika's Chariot, so they either have to draw a creature to play as well. So it's definitely good in that sense that it maybe prevents them from really doing anything with that creature, even if that creature can't attack or block. Then Kaya's Onslaught. It's a 3 mana instant spell that target creature gets +1/+1 and gains double strike on the turn. And then we can foretell it for 1 mana. This is kind of one of those cool spells that you can kind of catch your opponent off guard. We can foretell it in the early game. Maybe when we get a decent built-up board, maybe we have swing in very aggressively. We see what our opponent blocks, and then we can maybe flip this over, pay 1 mana. Now give that whatever creature that's not blocked +1/+1, and then double strike on top of it, so it deals double the damage that it's actually swinging in for, which is definitely very good, and in that sense helps us maybe finish off the game. And because the deck is fairly cheap and we're not playing anything super expensive, we went with 21 lands, as 3 drops being our most expensive things. And then our sideboard, we have Environmental Sciences, Reduced to Memory, 2 copies of, just exile target non-land permanent. Its controller creates a 3/2 white creature token. Inkling Summon it for a little bit of more flying. Spirit Summon in for just another 3/2. Expand Inhabity for that +1, 2 +1/+1 counters, and Introduction to Prophecy to draw a card and scry 2 in the process, which is definitely very good nonetheless. And I mean, guys, these are some decent budget decks that are on the cheaper side because there are no rares in them. I do think they kind of get you started in some of the more monocolored decks, depending on which way you want to go, especially if you want to play aggro. And at the same time, too, I do think the Dimir deck is another cool deck, with it also being a control deck that literally plays no rares, which is definitely very surprising that it works for being a control deck and not playing a single rare to kind of disrupt your opponent that way. But with that being said, if you liked the video, hit that like button. It definitely helps out a lot. If there's any deck that will be interesting to you, there'll be links for all of them down in the description like usual, so if you guys can always import them into Magic, try them out for yourself, see which one you like, maybe leave a comment of maybe which one you're playing as well. But that being said, if you want to post new videos on the channel, hit that subscribe button. I'll see you later.